Thank you, Uncle Tamaru. My name's Sophie Thomson and I'm going to be emceeing tonight's proceedings, and we're here because we're passionate about trees and we want change. So first off, we should acknowledge all our presenting partners: Conservation Council of South Australia, the National Trust, Trees for Life, Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, TreeNet and the Nature Conservation Society of South Australia. We should also welcome our VIPs. We've got the Honourable Nick Champion and Jane Stinson MP. We've got the Mayor of the City of Mitcham, Heather Holmes-Ross. On the 5th of November in 2019, I was traumatised by the removal of some beautiful ancient river red gums, literally less than a kilometre from where I live. They were cut off a metre from the ground, and I drove past when they were swinging from a crane. And when I rang the council to find out what had happened, apparently it had been advertised. But myself and many of the locals that were literally on the side of the road, almost in tears, had missed it because it was in a local paper that you have to pay for, and it's all about sport, and it was in the fine print at the back. So a number of us had missed it, or we would have been more active prior to the removal of those beautiful ancient trees. The trees were then craned to another spot where they dug a hole and repurposed. And when I stopped and yelled out at the guy and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "We are creating habitat." And I think he actually didn't understand how silly that sounded. And I said, "They are habitat." And then through a series of conversations, the poor arborist at the council had been delivered an ultimatum that the trees had to go, and he was trying to make the best out of the hollows in those trees that had to be removed for a sports field that's needed. And it was all these silly things that shouldn't have happened. If the speed limit at that point was 60 k's, those trees could have stayed, but it was 80 k's. Now, the speed limit is 60 k's. So I got slightly irate at the misleading way the communications department talked about their innovative solution to repurpose the trees to create a biodiversity hotspot at the new sports centre. And I called them out on it. And it went wild because people saw it happening in their patch, right? And people became passionate. And 3 years on, here we are, and we want to see change. And I'm very excited that this has come about. I'm sad that we had to lose those trees, but if those trees can be lost to protect others, then it has a good outcome. So, the purpose of tonight's meeting is simply that we have some of the lowest canopy cover and weakest tree protection laws in Australia. And it's time for that to change. We're going to hear from a range of experts about best practice tree protection, what it looks like, and what our state government is doing in response. Now, while I'm going to tell you all to please turn your phones to silent, we want you to use your phones tonight. What we want you to do is to tweet and post with #TreeChampion. We also want you to scan that QR code and visit Slido. If the scanner doesn't take you straight there, you can actually go to Slido and enter that number. We will put this up again later because we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of this panel. But first off, to kick off proceedings, I'm going to introduce Uncle Tamaru. He's a proud Kaurna and Narungga man. He's an emerging elder of the Kaurna nation, an educator of Kaurna culture, and a teacher of language. He is the CEO of the Deadly Mob Kaurna cultural programs and is passionate about his Mother Earth. Thank you, Uncle Tamaru.
I'm Tamaru, a proud Kaurna and Narungga man. I'm able to welcome you today on behalf of my Aboriginal ancestors, King Rodney and Baranado. My great-great-great-grandfather, his name was Mulawura Burka. The English people of the day called him King Rodney. My great-great-great-grandmother was Mary Monardo, so she used to be Queen of the Hills. King of the Flats got together and made my family, which gives me the birthright to welcome you. But more importantly, my name is on the signature of the Native Title Act of South Australia, Ghana, anyway, South Australia, which gives me the authority to welcome you. So in language, I'd like to say to you, Nyangatali, 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 Mary Changa Ghana Mirana, Ghana Mirana, Nyangatali, Ghana Tampansi, Martin Borby Tenda Nyenda, or Banda Balia. On behalf of my elders past, my elders present, I proudly welcome you to my beautiful native title Ghana country, and tonight I welcome you in the spirit of reconciliation. We all need to walk together softly on my country. My culture, my people are trying to teach you something quite profound. We're finding that you're not really listening to us, and we'd really like you to listen. So I'm going to teach you, treat you like my kindy kids. So back straight, eyes front, please. Right, Chris, can you come down front, fella? Yeah, he's all right. This fella here, he's my Yakatali, he's my dearest brother. We go way back to this fella. Now, are you listening?
Yeah, yes.
The Ghana community, we don't want to walk here in front of you. And the Ghana community, we don't want to walk here behind you. The Ghana community, we want to walk right here side by side with you. Because I acknowledge I am not more important than Chris. I acknowledge Chris is not more important than me. But more importantly, we need to walk together on this country. We can only do it by walking side by side. You know, this fella's got a lot of awesome knowledge about frogs and other critters in the bush. And I've got a lot of cultural knowledge that I like sharing, and we bounce off each other when we do tours together, so it's quite good fun. So this is what I call the true spirit of reconciliation. So I enjoy walking with your brother. Yeah, sorry. Now, I like having a little bit of fun when I do welcome, so unfortunately you spoke to me earlier, so you can come up front. And don't you laugh, you can come up front too. And while you're up, young lady, you guys can come up front too. And when you laugh about you, come up front. And there's a young fella over here, pretty handsome. Can you come up front here, brother? Right. Young lady, over here, please. Can you stand here? Have you been naughty with the law? Young man, since you're closer, you stand here, arm up, COVID safe, please. Then go back right. Not you, young lady. Arm up, COVID safe. Arm up. Young fella, you're here, and you're last. So we've all seen the Aboriginal flag, is that correct? Yep. It was actually invented on my country, Tengat Nyanga, back in 1971. The awesome Naranga people, they say 72, but what do they know, right? So it was actually invented on Ghana country at a place called Tengat Nyanga, Victoria Square. It was an art competition. People don't think and remember that it was an art competition. Art is interpreted by people differently. I think my art's awesome, Mrs. Tambourine thinks it's pretty average. Obviously, no, right? So we all interpret art differently. But this is a great way how I show you, you're not listening to us. You're not listening. This lady is going to represent 1971. She is going to tell 81 what the colours are. 81 is telling 91. 91 is telling 2000. 2000 is telling 2022 what the colours of the flag stand for. Eyes front. Do not turn around until somebody touches you, COVID, safe on the shoulder. When they touch you, COVID, safe, turn around, watch what they're doing. You're going to copy it, show the person in front. Do you understand? Adult voices, do you understand? Very attentive. So I'm Uncle Harold Thomas with 20 extra kilo. And I'm going to tell the world what the colours of the Aboriginal flag stand for. What's your money? You've got to copy and show the black colour. I'll touch you on the shoulder first. See, you're not listening. lesbian. Alright, now, 2000, you showed 2022, what you just saw. Alright, 2022, show the world what you just saw. Is everybody? See how you don't listen? People here. You know, I'm talking here from my heart now, and I want you all to listen. You know what's really upsetting my people at the moment? So I've been on this planet looking after my Mother Earth for 65,000 years. You might have only been here 200 years. You're ruining it.
Yeah.
We made our mistakes here that you didn't know about. You'll make them here. 200 years ago, you called me a native. 180 years ago, you called me Aborigine. And then you called me Indigenous. And then you called me Aboriginal. And now you're calling me First Nation. You need to pick one. You really do need to pick one. If we designed the flag and we invented the flag and we call it an Aboriginal flag, what are you not listening to? You see how it changed? Shall we get that to quite special? Right, so how does that lead crawling on the motorbike? He started at red out riding, because I like my motorbikes. Right, didn't pay that terrible. On behalf of my people, my family, welcome you today. I welcome you in the spirit of reconciliation. You need to listen to us. You know, Allan has been managing this country for 65,000 years. I love Chris because he's a listener and he encourages all his workers to listen to us. We burn the bush in the winter months. You burn it in summer. We burn the bush to manage country and propagate seeds. You put a crust on the earth and seeds can't grow. You know, these trees, I have Gara trees, the river red gums, they're my supermarket. I never had Coles, Aldi or Kmart. I'd go to a tree and get a possum near his bird. My most significant bird. His feathers my granddad wore, his granddad wore, and now I proudly wear. I have a red-tailed black cockatoo male feather, and I have a red-tailed black cockatoo female feather. As an elder in my community, when I wear this, men and women have to listen to me. When I'm out at home, Mrs. Tamaroo just laughs at me. But I can't find these birds anymore. They've all gone to Strath and they went to Kangaroo Island. We had the bushfire, they're now an endangered species. So these are the changes you're doing on our country. The river red gum. I've got one at Warraparinga, windy place by the river. I show kids when I talk about it, my hairs stand on the ends because that's our birthing tree. You might go around the corner here, you've got epidurals, electricity, gas and fueling. We had a tree, but we still managed. We need to look after our Mother Earth better. But how do we explain it to you? You know, we're the only people that have native title of a capital city. We've got the right to ask you to look after it better. You know, manage it better. Listen to us. These Green Adelaide people with Department of Environment, they came to us when we did the largest cultural bird in the southern hemisphere on the South Parklands. We did it in winter. Because I showed you, you're very, I don't know, visualisation culture. We can articulate it to these people, Green Adelaide and the Park Rangers and Forestry SA, and they didn't get it until we showed them how to do it. But I am so happy in my heart to see so many people here that care about my trees and my community. It's quite special, actually. So I really encourage you to go out there, sow the seed. Let's look after our land. I've got friends of people here. I've got Blackwood Action Group here. They look after our country. You know, how can I explain to you, and how can you listen to me to say that I've walked this country for 56 years and I've never heard my mob say we own this country. We're custodians of this country for our kids. So this thing over that young one, come up here, young lady. We need to look after our trees for this one. My future, my hope. You know, when I go to schools and I see people like this in my class, I don't look at them as students, I look at them as governors, as mayors, as lawyers, as ministers. And when they interact with our people, when something about an Aboriginal person crosses their bench, they're not going to stick it in the 2R basket, they're going to deal with it. And that's what it's about. And it is about time. But we're doing it for this people. All right, so remember that. We're custodians of this country for her. All right, in language I'll say to you, Natalia, my respect. Thank you, young lady. I do have somebody recording it for me, I've just got to go to another welcome and movie, so it's all good. I feel welcome day for me today. So Natalia, my respect, hope you have a good day. In closing, can you say Gana Miana? Napu? Naniana? Tapaniti? And Natalia? Right, that's an acknowledgement of my beautiful country, my language, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Please not know I'm waving, I'll go like that.
Now, for people out in the foyer, come on in. There are seats up the back. We're going to watch a short video now. This is part of a series that's been produced to highlight examples of where our tree laws are failing us and why it's important we learn to live with trees in our urban environment.
Next door, there was a beautiful lemon-scented gum that was quite big with lots of birds living in it. It was so lush and gorgeous. We could see it from our back door and through the windows in our house. The person that lived in that property registered the tree as a significant tree. Then she moved, and the person that bought the house applied to the council to have the tree removed, and the council refused. They said it was a significant tree and it couldn't be removed. And he went back and cleaned out a very old swimming pool, which had been filled in with dirt for the past 40 years. They had used it as an orchard. They buried their rubbish in there because it was cracked and couldn't hold water. It was like a ruin of a pool. It didn't have a pool fence. You wouldn't have known if you were in that backyard that there was even an old derelict pool there. And then he went and dug that all out and then went back to the council, and according to the regulations, he was allowed to have the tree removed because it was within 10 metres of a swimming pool. One day we heard the chainsaws. I spoke to him and he said the council had given him permission, and the council said they knew that the pool was unusable, would never be used, but according to the regulations, if he took them to court, they would lose, and therefore they granted him permission to remove the tree. It was just that loophole that he managed to have that tree removed because of a loophole in the regulations. So many birds in the neighbourhood were upset by that tree going for weeks and weeks. They just didn't have anywhere to go. They were all distressed because they were fighting for habitat in other trees that were nearby, which have since been cut down as well. The one thing that really, really upset me was when the tree was removed, there was one sulphur-crested cockatoo that just wouldn't leave the tree, and he kept hopping from branch to branch. As the branches got cut down, you'd see him in the evening on the next branch, and then the next day further up the tree, pecking, looking for somewhere that used to be. It was really upsetting.
My goodness. Now I'm going to introduce our next two speakers. We've got Joanna Wells and Craig Wilkins. After working in education for 30 years, Joanna now works with the Conservation Council and the National Trust. With a focus on natural and built heritage seen through the lens of climate change, she has worked to prevent inappropriate roadworks, save the Wake Green Gatehouse, keep Ayers House publicly accessible, and roll out the Climate Action Now campaign across Adelaide. Craig is the Chief Executive of the Conservation Council of South Australia. He straddles the insider-outsider divide as an appointed member of the Premier's Climate Change Council, the Adelaide Parklands Authority, and a wide range of working groups and committees, while also leading and assisting campaigns and movements for change. Together, alongside many others, they've helped lead a multifaceted community campaign to reform our tree protection laws. Welcome, Craig and Joanna.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, everybody, for coming along tonight. So, as Sophie said, our journey actually tonight started with those trees at Mount Barker. There was such a community uproar that emerged from that appalling story that we were able to harness and capture that energy and turn it into action. And I would like to again acknowledge the partners. This has been a communal journey with lots of people from the community assisting and working with us, because the expertise is there in the community amongst all of you here. So what we started with was we weren't sure of the size of the problem back then. And so we did a lot of research, asked a lot of questions, and tried to work out what the size of the problem was and why it was a problem. And this was our first report, What's Happening to Adelaide's Trees, in June of 2020. And we quickly discovered that we weren't tracking well nationally. So this is one particular national report which indicated that Adelaide has the lowest proportion of tree canopy among Australia's capitals, with just 27%.
So that prompted us to action, and we certainly had lots of opportunities for that. So the Mike Turter Bikeway, the top and the central one, and then we ran a How Many More Premier campaign. That came about from the devastating loss of big trees on the side of the road when DIT was running through and doing road widening projects. So we wanted to know how many more of these are we prepared to lose. The Golden Grove Road upgrade, for instance, lost huge numbers. DIT doesn't have to apply for planning approval to remove them. They have an exemption. The question about the number of roadside trees that we might lose prompted me to ask of the Waite Arboretum staff just what the replacement is that's needed if you take a big old tree that's healthy from the side of the road. So we know that the regulations expect that if it's a significant tree, we replace it, in inverted commas I would say, with 3 saplings. If you take out a 140-year-old gum that's in good health from the side of the road and you want an equal, so like-for-like replacement in terms of the cleaning of the air that one tree has been doing, you need 891 metre high saplings if you're not going to lose air quality. So we went out to some specialists. We commissioned Dean Nicole to write a report for us, and that was a really key piece of evidence in convincing the government that the Belair National Park development, so removal of remnant grey box grassy woodland in order to put down soccer pitches in a national park, was not okay.
Then after that work with lots of different experts, we produced our second report which sort of summarised the suggestions and the advice around what law reform was required. And I suppose the key point is that we spoke to a lot of people across councils, across government, arborists and the community, ecologists, and captured all the evidence of what needs to change. And central to the theme that emerged was that we needed to remove the current exemptions, which allowed a lot of the damage to occur. That swimming pool story is a classic example of the kind of exemptions that exist. Another one is in this is actually a picture of the suburb of Glenalta. So under bushfire law, protection laws, you can cut down a tree if it's within 20 metres of a dwelling. This is a capturing of 20 metres of every dwelling in Glenalta. And as you can see, the laws would potentially allow someone to cut down virtually every single tree in that suburb. And then we looked at how do we compare across states and territories. And a series of reports, and I'd like to acknowledge Tom Morrison, who's in the front row and will be speaking a bit later on, as one of the lead authors on that fantastic work about working out how far behind we were other places.
All right, so this is a DIT roadside example of an exemption, so native revegetation area. It's just classic. This is Golden Grove Road. So the tree that you see on the left here was 8.4 metres around. It's pre-European settlement. It's a remnant. It was in beautiful health. That was removed, and the road didn't even need to come out. It could actually have remained. So the net result of that project was the loss of 180 trees, very similar, most of them, to that one that you see there. The end result with the road is it's still a one-lane road both ways. The bikeway is down the side in a really nice straight line, which is pretty boring, and it's quite away from the road. So we could actually have had both rather than that either or. And this is another example. This is out at Springwood, so development just to the east of Gawler. The tree that you see there is reliably aged to be 1,000 years old. It's a mallee box. So at the time that this tree was sprouting and starting to grow, starting its journey through life, the Vikings were roaming Northern Europe. That was taken out. So the photo on the right is the trunk that remained. Just to give you an idea of the size, Gary, who's standing there taking a photo of it, is 6 foot. The base of it would actually be wider than what Gary is tall. To add to that, on the left, the Portaloo is pretty well in the exact spot where that tree was. We met some really lovely young people at Springwood the other day. They were down around just below the hill from where their home was being built, excitedly telling their friends about, why don't you buy this block? And they were very excited about the fantastic view that they had out over the trees. We didn't have the heart to tell them that a tree just like that one had actually been removed from the very block that they're building their home on.
So, after all our work, we're confident about three things. Firstly, we are losing a huge amount of mature trees every single year in Adelaide. Key finding 2 is that most of the tree loss is on private land, and there is not enough space in public hands to replace the trees we're losing from private land. And our key finding, number 3, is that we won't turn this around unless we have law reform. And the reason why we think this is that there's actually a split incentive at the moment, whereby the benefits of trees are shared by everyone, but some of the costs and inconvenience and the challenge of tree management is on the individual private landowner. And there's too much money, too much incentive to either remove or reduce that tree as an individual landowner. Also, we haven't got the time. We desperately need to preserve these trees now, and to change culture and practice takes a long time, but law reform can happen overnight. The good news is that the Malinowskis government committed at the last state election to do something about this, which was a fantastic thing. So they are committing to reverse the loss of green space and tree canopy and institute Australian best practice for tree removal regulations. And that's the reason why we're basically here tonight, is to find out more about what that looks like.
And we have very good reason to be optimistic. So first reason for that is that you're all here tonight. There are so many people across Adelaide who aren't here, but we know they feel the same way that we do about trees. We're also off to a really good start under Minister Nick Champion. So one of the first things that was announced was that the Frome Road trees, 100-year-old London plane trees, was safe. So they were saved. They were going to be removed to simply allow a driveway into lot 14. It was the first step that Renewal SA had done. Hadn't looked at any other options, just went to the council and said, we want to take them out. Went back to the drawing board, came up with a better option. And then we've also had very recently, most of you will remember, the last remnant grey box in Nunley, also saved by Minister Champion and also by Jane Badco and Kate Hubby. Where are you? So there are a lot of people here working very hard, and we feel that we're off to a good start and optimistic about what's to come.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna and Craig. Now our next speaker is Dr. Stefan Kadri-Retallick. He's an adjunct lecturer in the School of Biological Services at the University of Adelaide. His work focuses on the effective management of ecosystems in the face of climate change. He has particular interests in urban trees and in bridging the gap between scientists and government. Earlier this year, the Uni of Adelaide was commissioned by the State Planning Commission to review the urban tree protection rules across Australia. Please welcome Dr. Stefan Kadri-Retallick. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that generous welcome. Gosh, there are a lot of you. So I was asked today to come and talk about best practice tree protection. What does that look like? And that was in response to some of the work that the Conservation Council has done, that Craig and Joanna talked about. I was part of a team from the University of Adelaide that was contracted by the Attorney General's Department, Planning and Land Use Services, to look at the work that they'd done and say, you know, is it as bad as we're suggesting? How can the South Australian government reform our tree protection laws? Now, when you're looking at trying to come up with good regulations, good ways of achieving things as government, regulation is only one part of the picture. Regulation is really important because that tells us what to do. But we also need to have strong economic drivers. We need to make sure that we're not creating perverse economic incentives, that people can't make money by doing something that is against the interests of society. And we need to bring people along with us because we don't want to live in a police state. We want people to believe in the work that we're doing. And if you don't achieve these three things, then you don't manage to get good policy. You don't get good outcomes. So when we had a look at the South Australian tree protection laws, we looked at 101 interstate metropolitan councils. So these are councils that are similar to Adelaide, or the metropolitan councils of Adelaide, and we found that about 2/3 of them used at least one size-based protection for protecting trees. So 52% used height-based protections. They said if a tree is a certain height, then it automatically becomes protected. Half use circumference-based protection, like South Australia does. And just over 1/5 use crown spread-based protections. And the most powerful approach is probably to use a combination of these, because there are some trees that will never reach 2 metres or will never reach a certain height, but these are still worthy of protection. So if we have a look at circumference protection, because this is what's used by South Australia, this was used by half of the councils interstate, and 78% of them picked 50 centimetres or less as the circumference at which a tree is protected. 95% said if it's a metre or greater, then we will protect it. And one council said if it's 140 centimetres, that will be the threshold. South Australia sits out here at 2 metres protection. If we have a look at height, each one of those vertical bars there is one council interstate, and this was actually the most popular way of protecting trees. It's a little bit trickier to measure. You don't just need a measuring tape around the base of the tree. So the best way to do this is with a laser rangefinder, but you can also do it by estimating the heights of nearby structures. So power lines, for example, are at about 8 metres. People are about 1.6 to 1.8 metres high. So you can estimate that reasonably well. South Australia doesn't use this one at all. We found that most councils were using tree protections of about 4 metres. Crown spread. Crown spread was used by about 20% of councils, not used in South Australia at all, just like height. An average of about 3.5 metres crown spread, which is not very big. That's probably from here to the wall away. So we're talking about reasonably small trees. This is pretty easily measured by pacing out on the ground, but one huge benefit of this protection is that you can do it from Google Earth or Google Maps, any of these sort of free online platforms. It can be done remotely. Councils can easily do it. It's also very easy to enforce for that reason. One thing to be aware of with this measure is that trees can, of course, be pruned and often do need to be pruned. Particularly also with deciduous trees, it can change a little bit, which is another reason why combining these methods is a really useful approach. So what does this mean on the ground? It's easy to imagine a range of reasons that you might want to remove a protected tree. For example, it might be in your backyard and it might be undermining the foundations of your house. That's a reasonable reason to say, I might want to remove that tree. In Adelaide, any regulated or significant tree that is within 10 metres of a house or in-ground swimming pool, except for a eucalyptus species or Agonus flexuosa, is exempted from protection. So this little house that I've drawn here, that's got a pretty generous frontage of 20 metres, and we can see that together with the house and the pool, nearly all of that house is exempt, or all of that property is exempt from protection, which is very similar to the examples that Joanna and Craig shared with us. Interstate, a minority of councils generate a 2 to 3 metre buffer from houses and significant structures only. So these aren't carports and backyard sheds and things like that. These are houses. Swimming pools don't usually get a look in. 3 metre generated clearance, so much smaller. In that situation, all of those trees would be protected. And the majority of councils interstate don't use any clearance envelope at all. And you need to demonstrate that a protected tree is having a significant impact on a structure in order to apply for it to be removed. So quite a different state of affairs. Effectively what this means in Adelaide is that only a tiny proportion of suburban homes are really able to support protected trees without any exemptions. And we'll see what that looks like in reality shortly. So looking at species protections, so most jurisdictions, more than 90% around Australia, exempt some species from protection. These are usually because they're weeds. They're things like olive trees or willows, species that we don't want to protect. But every one of these are the species that we exempt here in South Australia, and every one of those species will have its detractors and every one will have its defenders. And I can guarantee that every one of those has the capacity to be a high value tree in some circumstances. Maybe not everywhere, maybe not in bushland, but certainly in residential homes. For example, desert ash, Fraxinus there, that's one of Adelaide's most widely planted street trees. And it's planted by councils because it performs well, it's a great shady tree, and while it does have a propensity to get into waterways and become an invasive species, in a backyard it's very unlikely to cause a problem. One of the big reasons that species exemptions are problematic is that trees are actually really hard to identify. This tree here was identified as a spotted gum. It was in a house at Beaumont, and earlier this year, because it was a spotted gum, a Corymbia, it wasn't able to be. It was within 10 metres of the house. It wasn't protected by the eucalypt law, and it was able to be removed by the homeowner. Unfortunately, following the removal, it was determined that it wasn't a Corymbia maculata at all. It was actually a Eucalyptus saligna, and that tree was illegally removed. Now, the arborist, it was a professional arborist who was responsible for the tree identification. That arborist was fined $5,200, which was less than 5% of the possible penalty, and goes to show just how easily it is to make a whoopsie mistake and clear a fantastic tree. For this reason, I think that in the urban environment, species exemptions should be treated very sparingly. That's perhaps different in a regional environment or a peri-urban environment, but certainly in the suburbs, I think that's a difficult one to get good results with. There are lots and lots of others. This report on the right here, Urban Tree Protection in Australia, a review of regulatory matters, was contracted by Planning and Land Use Services. And in that report, my co-authors and I address a whole bunch of other ways that interstate councils protect trees, using planning-based overlays and protecting trees in certain locations, protecting particular species with higher thresholds, regulating the arboricultural industry, which is currently largely unregulated. Any one of you could decide that you're an arborist tomorrow and go out and start practicing as an arborist. Economic instruments, so this is charging bonds and fees. Empowering local governments to make their own local laws for tree protection. At the moment, this is all state government rules in South Australia. Methodologies for valuing trees, tree protection registers, and penalties. And this is both monetary penalties, but also things like shaming signs. And there are a range of interesting approaches that are used interstate and overseas. So if you're interested in those things, go read that report, because I don't have time to talk about them now. So I promised that I'd give you a bit of an indication about what this looks like on the ground. So under the current planning system, there's very little economic value that is put on a tree. In fact, in many ways, trees are worth negative money. There's a huge incentive to remove a tree if you're undertaking any type of development. So this is 2 properties in 2015. I've highlighted 3 regulated trees there. And this is those 2 properties 7 years later. Now, in the upper property there, they're likely regulated trees. They're within 10 metres of the dwelling though, so they're not protected unless they're eucalypts or Agonus flexuosa. For the lower trees, they're possibly unregulated. All 3 of these big trees could have been retained in those developments because they're on the edge of the properties. They're not smack bang in the middle. It was possible to build houses around them. But retaining the trees in those situations would have meant that a tree exclusion zone, a tree protection zone, would have needed to have been established. It would have been restricted, moving earth-moving machinery in there. Those trees would have had to have been maintained. It would have meant development was more expensive and slower as a result. Instead, the proponents in that situation removed those trees. They paid a few $100s for the application and to pay into an offset scheme. And what this means is that we've got a huge incentive for developers to remove those trees, not just work around them. They're much better off removing them. Here's another property. This is in Adelaide South. So this is a corner block that was purchased and divided into 3. So there was certainly an opportunity to retain those 2 eucalypts out the front of the house there, but it would have been difficult to divide that into 3 blocks. If 2 blocks had been divided rather than 3, it would have been relatively straightforward to keep those 2 trees with a driveway. If we look at the blocks that exist now, there's not enough space in them for large trees, and there is nowhere on any of those properties that a tree could exist and not be exempt from current protections. So how could this be improved? What would best practice tree protection look like? How would we stop this from happening? Well, we could introduce a tree protection system with bonds based on the projected value of the developed land. So that block there, that corner block on the left, that's about 2,500 square metres. And of that, about 500 square metres of that is covered by the canopy of those trees on the private land. Before the subdivision, the property was valued at about $280 a square metre. Now, it would be reasonably straightforward for councils or state government to project the value of that land after subdivision. And it would be something like $560,000, $560 per square metre once this development had occurred, once this subdivision had occurred. So it roughly doubled in value. Now, if we were to multiply that figure by the area of those trees on private land, that would give us a figure of $280,000, which is not actually very, it's reasonably consistent with the value of mature eucalypts that is used by the City of Melbourne, Thayer methodology, these tree valuation methodologies that exist. So the council or state government could say to that developer, if you want to remove those large trees, we would like you to pay into an offset fund of $280,000 because that's what those trees are worth. Or pay a bond for the protection of those trees. Once your development is complete and those trees are healthy and retained, you can have your money back. That would take away the economic incentive for the developer to remove those trees. They're still free to develop the land and to make money by subdividing and building new properties, but it would mean that they have an incentive to remove the trees, or at least no incentive to remove them. So going on to the social issues, trees are a real nuisance. They are a pain. This social stuff is really important to address, and it's really easy to forget this stuff, but we really do need to think about it, because trees cause people problems. They drop litter on the ground, gumnuts, I really like this, council knew of gumnut dangers. They drop litter in gutters and pools, they drop resin on your car, the roots can lift pavement. They also shade solar panels. One of the #1 council complaints that people get is the trees are shading my solar panels. I'm losing out on money because of your trees or my neighbour's trees. And this leads to a really strong NIMBY vibe. I love trees, but it does drop leaves in the gutter. Not in my backyard. So there's a really clear role here for government to play in educating the public and not providing incentives for perverse outcomes. So coming back to the solar panel example, solar panels pay about 5 cents per kilowatt hour in terms of feed-in tariff into the grid. So the value of selling electricity is not that high. If you have a standard 5 kilowatt system, you might get $3, a few dollars a day on sunny days if your panels aren't being shaded at all. Shade from a tree can be up to 10 degrees cooler than shade from any other structure. Not the difference between standing in the sun and standing in the shade. I'm talking about shade from a shade sail or a building versus shade from a tree. And that's because trees transpire and they have a transpiration effect. That evaporative effect means that trees are a lot cooler. So that means that if a tree is shading your house enough to dampen your solar panels, it is also shading your house enough to keep your house far cooler in summer. So any money that you're losing from not getting quite so much feed-in tariff, you would be more than making up in summer, where cooling costs are 30 to 40% of your electricity bill. In addition, of course, we reduce the impact of power generation and we increase the carbon sequestration by locking up carbon dioxide in that tree. Then, of course, there is fear. It is amazing how easy these headlines are to find. Trees cause about 5 deaths per year in Australia, and it's actually really difficult to define what a tree death is because, if I climb a tree and the branch breaks or I fall out of the tree, it counts as a tree death. So given how very many trees we have in Australia, South Australia, Adelaide, not so much, it's amazing that we don't see more deaths from trees. They are tremendously stable structures. You're approximately 2 to 3 times more likely to die from a lightning strike, about 43 times more likely to die from an assault, and about 240 times more likely to die in a car accident. The risk assessment for each individual tree is based on an arborist assessment. That's an arborist going out, it's not benchmarked against the actual rate of tree failure in Australia, and that's work that's currently being undertaken by various insurers, the arboricultural peak bodies and others, but it's a huge problem because we tend to overestimate the risk of tree failure, particularly in sensitive areas like schools. Just because there's a child underneath a tree doesn't mean that it's more likely to fail. Trees also tend to fail in periods of high stress, which is not usually when people are sitting under them. I'm talking about storms. People don't tend to sit outside under trees in these kind of events where trees tend to fail. So, prestige and education. Established trees are really hard to move. You can't buy them. You can't go to Bunnings and buy a mature tree. I used to watch people trying to transplant big mature palms around Adelaide. Every now and then you still see it. Usually they die. It's super expensive, the failure rate is high, so there is a prestige associated with them. They reflect the history of the house, the history of a community. And people tend to want to preserve old houses. You know, they say, this is a lovely old Federation house or a Victorian house or whatever it was. I want to protect this old banister, I want to protect this wrought iron door, whatever it might be. Why not so with trees? This is some work that we could do. There's a huge correlation between wealthier suburbs and health. But it's not recognised that we assume that that's because rich people get to go to the doctor more often. That's probably true. But it's also to do with the fact that these greener neighbourhoods are associated with higher urban biodiversity, higher green spaces, and that is also a huge driver of health. There is a huge correlation between exposure to green spaces and better respiratory, gut and psychological health. People who live near trees live longer, have healthier lives, are happier. Adelaide has spent a lot of money becoming a national park city and has some very, very passionate people at Green Adelaide, one of whom is sitting in the front row. So let's empower them to educate our community about trees. It's the easiest sell in the world if we choose to make that case and to share that passion that we have. Speaking of lots of work, local governments and the state government have spent a huge amount of time and effort over the past 10 plus years generating these documents. This took me about 30 seconds of Googling to pull up these documents. There are dozens more of these. There are all of these tree-focused documents, strategies, plans, aspirational targets that have been produced to achieve a green, highly livable city. This is something that we all want. It's very, very popular. However, all of these documents are overshadowed by these documents. These are the acts, regulations and directions that are produced by the state government that present trees as a threat. You know, trees fall over, they damage infrastructure, they carry fire, they get in the way of our power lines. And if these documents aren't harmonised, then we will never see a step change in our tree protection, because we will have these documents that overrule any of the aspirational targets that we have. The Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act is a really important one because, as many of you would be aware, there's currently a review going on of the Planning Implementation Code. And recently, the expert panel that has been convened to look at that produced a discussion paper in which they explicitly said they will not be looking at tree protection methodologies, nor will they be looking at making recommendations about the exemptions to those methodologies. So they've explicitly said, we will not be touching this stuff. So if that's the case, and that is how the Planning Implementation Review proceeds, then certainly we won't see any harmonisation between these documents. As it stands, the scope of that needs to be increased a lot in order to get the alignment between these documents that we're going to see, in order to get the kind of harmonisation we need to get better canopy outcomes. I've given you a couple of ideas about how that could be achieved, but it really needs to be comprehensive across local and state government strategies, plans, acts and regulations. So I've given you a few teasers as to how we went today. I'd really like to thank the Conservation Council for inviting me today. I'd like to thank the state government for sponsoring this work and giving us the opportunity to put it all together. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Ricky Belder and Kate Delaporte, who have been fantastic advocates in all of this space. And I'd really like to leave you with that quote. A smart city is a city where humans, trees, birds and other animals can grow with all their glories, imperfections, freedom and creativity. They are not just cities of technology, but cities of love, life, beauty, dignity, freedom and equality. Thank you.
Would you plant a red gum in your backyard? Well, we did, as a commitment to the future and to this bit of Kaurna land. Being a responsible guardian of one of the biggest and grandest of the original Adelaide Plains flora is definitely a commitment. But it's been a joy and a revelation sharing this family home with a tree that began as a small seedling and is now a significant tree with a circumference of over 3 metres. It's now 31 years old and an island of both attraction and value to a diverse array of passing wildlife, including crows, magpies, currawongs, sulphur-crested cockatoos, wattlebirds and Murray magpies who have nested in it for years. Occasionally a koala turns up and spends a day or two resting in its crown. There's always something going on up there. Sharing our lives with this tree and all the wildlife it attracts has been one of the great joys and the ultimate payoffs of giving up this part of the garden to this original Adelaide Plains tree. It's a living connection to what once grew across our suburb. When the big gales blow in from the southwest and the tree roars and sways, I think of the day that we planted it and wonder if it might fail. But at 31, it's not even a teenager by definition, and it bends and bears the brunt and is still there in the morning. Neighbours love our red gum in the golden hour when the western sun lights it up and highlights its mottled boughs and trunk, or when it's full of birds calling in the first light of dawn, or the haunting call of boo-books high above in the depths of the night. Its trunk is so huge now that I can't really hug it anymore, just embrace it. As I do, I take pleasure in whispering to it that I will protect it and fight for it as long as I'm alive. It's the least I can do after the pleasure and happiness, as well as the understanding it has given to us.
At the state election earlier this year, the Malinowskis government, recognising the community concern about tree loss, committed to reverse the loss of green space and tree canopy across our suburbs by achieving Australian best practice for tree removal regulations and a targeted plan with Green Adelaide for new plantings so everyone benefits from access to green space near them. Tonight, to tell us more, is the man whose job it is to deliver on that commitment. The Honourable Nick Champion, MP, Minister for Trade and Investment, Minister for Housing and Urban Development, and the Minister for Planning. Please welcome Minister Champion.
Thanks, Sophie. Certainly like to begin by acknowledging Uncle Tamaru's very kind welcome and to acknowledge the Kaurna people and their elders past, present and emerging. To Craig Wilkins and to Joanna, to my parliamentary colleague, Jane Stinson, very passionate advocate for her local area and the grey box trees as well in that particular reserve, or what is now going to become a reserve. To Heather Holmes-Ross, I saw Heather, Mayor of Mitcham. I've been out to Mitcham and trees came up out there, certainly is a big issue. I'd also like to acknowledge Craig's very important Conservation SA's very important previous reports, which did set the scene for this community campaign. It's good to see that so many passionate people here, and I could hear the sort of trauma that was going on as people relived some of those events that perhaps have brought you all here today. Obviously, we've made an election commitment and we were elected to government, so we certainly intend to deliver on that commitment. And it's interesting in reflecting on some of the issues that have come up in my portfolio. Trees have been some of the most important early ones. The trees down on Frome Road, which was because of Lucy Hood's intervention. She rang my office, she talked me through it. I asked Renewal SA, who I happen to be Minister for. And the interesting thing about that is that they actually didn't need to remove them at all. It would have been a cost to Renewal SA to remove them, and it was really actually quite unnecessary. So it didn't actually, I don't want to present myself as something I'm not. It wasn't that hard an intervention. I just asked. And I think that perhaps, perhaps we need to reflect on that as a proviso. Perhaps we're not asking enough in the first instance. So I found that out as a minister. Obviously, as a Minister for Planning, one of my issues is housing affordability and planning, and my act, as Stefan reflected on, is part of that picture. So if we look at Adelaide's development, we started off with William Light, who designed the grid and the parklands that surround the city, which make us unique. Particularly there is a city, no other city like it in the world, And we know that that continued. Adelaide's development pattern, if you like, was really to build on farms as we spread out. We just kept on building on farms. Sometimes we did it very well. There's a garden suburb of Colonel William Light, but if you go down to, or if you go up to Elizabeth, where I was born, that was once a farm, and presumably prior to being a farm, it was country that had trees on it and native bushland. When my parents moved to Marion, we moved to one of the old farmhouses on Oliphant Avenue. There was an almond tree in the back garden. That almond tree's not there now. There's a house there. So we had this development pattern, I think, which allowed us to spread out along the plains. That had a cost to it, but it was basically small houses on big blocks, and often people planted trees, fruit trees and other trees, in their back gardens. We've now, since the advent of the 30-year plan, had a focus on infill because we didn't want to keep pushing out. And we protected areas in the south and areas in the north and the Barossa and the like with the environmental and food protection areas. So that's a good thing, but the pressure it put on infill, we saw some of those pictures there, which are, perhaps a better use of infrastructure and the like, but they have had a consequence for trees, I think, that was not perhaps processed when the first 30-year plans were coming out. And to give you an idea, 67% of our growth has been coming from urban infill. So it's a very big, notwithstanding we saw the effects of some of the greenfield expansion at Mount Barker and Gawler East as well. Density's been creating an issue for trees, and obviously greenfield growth creates an issue for trees. Perhaps the only area of densification that does not are very tall buildings, but we know that Adelaide, my first interview as planning minister, someone rang up and they said, I don't like greenfield, don't like outer suburban growth, I don't like infill, and I don't like tall buildings. It was a bit hard to know where to go after that. And it's important to acknowledge the drivers for these things are not always population growth, but the changes in the way people are living. So more of us living on our own and more of us living in more complex family arrangements, more diverse family arrangements, which have lowered the number of people per household. So we're trying to get at what is a very difficult balancing act between improving our tree laws and the 30-year plan, which is coming down the track at us, which will map out Adelaide's growth for the next 30 years. One of the things we promised at the election was an expert panel to look into the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act and the Code, and they're currently undertaking that. Not despite Stephen saying, while they've said that they won't provide specific recommendations to me, they are the vehicle for us to examine the issue, and they're the vehicle by which I chose to release those reports, which were commissioned by the State Planning Commission. So what we've got at the moment is a fairly complex, a period of community consultation, community conversation, and a process, both the expert panel, and we're now currently doing the regional plans for the 30-year plan, and next year will be the plan for Greater Adelaide, and that is being funded so we can do it appropriately and think carefully about what might be our development pattern over the next 30 years. And that's an important piece of public policy work. It's the vehicle by which we've released the reports, and of course it's the vehicle by which all of you can make submissions and have your say. It won't, of course, be the end of the process, because inevitably when governments, I've seen these boomerangs come out with reviews or expert panels or like, at the end of the day the work always returns to the minister, always returns to the government, and then you have to actually implement change, which is a very, very difficult thing. And Stephen sort of talked about that you have to convince the community and talk to the community. and discuss these things with the community in order to have a deep sort of social licence to implement them. So that sort of outlines the process. I should sort of say that most of the advice coming back to me, the sort of anecdotal advice, is that our tree laws are underdone. Even developers have said that quite often it's kind of easier for them to clear a block or the like. And it's interesting, there are some strange sort of byproducts of all of this, believe it or not. I was down at a friend's place about would have been just after I was appointed as minister, and he had a nice frangipani it was in a pot, but it was quite big. And frangipanis take a long time to grow. They're a great tree. I said, "Oh, it's a lovely tree you got there." He goes, "Yeah, I bought it for $5,000. And he bought it off someone who was prospecting for these trees as developers take them out, and he then sells them. So there's an example, I suppose, of the economic value of a tree that had been taken out of a block, taken down to Port Adelaide, and then he had bought it. And it seems to be a strange social phenomenon when that is occurring. So we want to make sure we hold to our election commitment. This process is part of that. The State Planning Commission's released some work, not just these reports, but a guide for plantings and new developments. It seems to me to be, a good thing that so many of you are here tonight, and I'm sure we'll have a really great question and answer session. It is a challenge, I think, to get the balance right, and it is going to be a challenge for government to get the balance right, because inevitably you do have infrastructure that has to go in, and that can often present sort of pretty agonising choices for policy makers, for decision makers. It isn't easy, and we have to make sure that when we do that, that it's done in an appropriate way, in a sensible way, and we've really looked at every option before we do things. So I'll let us get to the questions. Hopefully people will be cognizant of the fact that we're at a particular time and place in our state's history. We're trying to balance these competing demands on our development, and I look forward to you all participating, not just tonight, but in the expert panel and the 30-year plan. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Minister. Okay, so now we're going to have this Q&A session, and we're going to be using Slido. So again, please scan the QR code. Hopefully it will take you straight to the app and open it up on your phone, and then you have the ability to type in a question. If it doesn't, go straight to Slido and enter that code. Now, questions will come up on the screen in a minute, and I'm going to try and get through as many questions as we can. You can also upvote questions. So when you look at the questions, if you think that's the thing, rather than us having hundreds of different ones, if that's what you're passionate around, please make sure that you upvote them. Also in the audience tonight, we should point out that we've got two people able to answer specific questions. We've got Professor Chris Daniels, Chair of Green Adelaide, ABC Guru and Radio Star, and an expert on urban ecology. And we've also got Tom Morrison. Tom, do you want to stand up and just turn around so people can see you? Tom is the founder of the popular 20-metre tree Facebook page. Hear, hear. He's also lead author of many of the reports featured tonight and winner of the Mitcham Council Young Citizen of the Year Award and this year's Jill Hudson Award for Environmental Protection for his tree advocacy and policy work. Okay, so, oh, it's right there in front of me. Okay, awesome. Minister, do you want to stand up here? I'll let you pass that. We'll give you a microphone and we will let Chris and Tom interject if they think it's... with respect when... okay, so exemption for DIT be removed.
Well, I don't think so, is the long and the short of it. And I don't want to lead people into thinking that that exemptions will be removed particularly when I haven't discussed it with the Minister for Transport. But one of the things I have been discussing with my CE is writing to all the other government departments about tree removal and just reminding them that we are going into this process. The government does have this commitment, and we've got the 30-year plan which is part of the process of internally with government and talking about how departments interact with planning. So it is an issue for discussion, but I don't think the exemption will go, is the long and the short of it.
Not good enough. Not good enough.
Why will the review panel not be making recommendations about specific tree circumference, height or canopy spread?
Well, they've put out a discussion paper. Like I said, this is actually the work had begun on trees with the State Planning Commission. So they'd actually commissioned the report, and they've been working on a body of work anyway for new homes and dealing with this urban infill issue. It's not just trees, it's stormwater, parking, there's a range of other issues. So one of the things I've done through the expert panel, these reports were coming to me. I use the expert panel to put them out for public discussion. So that's one of the reasons you can read them all. And I did that quite deliberately because I wanted for all of you to be able to discuss it, and if you liked them, that was good, and if you wanted to give me a bit of feedback by hissing at me, or that's fine too, because it's important that we have those discussions. I appreciate people are not going to, this is the beginning of a process. I appreciate people are really passionate about it. And part of my job at this point is to listen. So
If you had listened to tomorrow, you wouldn't be saying that you would not consider it.
Let's keep going. South Australia is the only state with a one-size-fits-all tree protections. This doesn't work or meet community expectations. How will the state government address this?
Well, we're the only state with a single code, so I think that's important. And the new code does actually have sort of somewhat better protections than in the previous Act. And you saw an example with the pool probably happened under the previous Act and previous arrangements. So, we're dealing with a single code, single planning system. We've got an e-planning system. That has some challenges to it. But it also has some advantages as well in that, we can actually, if we deal with tree regulation, it'll be dealt with across the Adelaide area rather than kind of a hodgepodge of councils, which it is in the other states. So it's a feature of South Australia's planning system at the moment.
Now, I know there are arborists that are qualified in the room here tonight. And this is an interesting question. Why is there no regulation for arborists in South Australia?
I don't know, but I was shocked when I was talking to Stefan there about that. He also said that in a peculiar sort of arrangement, you can only get into an arborist course at TAFE if you work in the industry, which seems to me to be a bit of a kind of strange closed shop type of arrangement. So that's obviously an area we can look at. Obviously an area, it seems to me that most professions need to have qualifications, need to have some area of regulation around them. At the moment, we've got a bit of a shortage of planners and a whole range of other professions which are important to the state. And I'm in the process of talking to the universities about that. So this seems to me to be one more occupation on the list that perhaps has to be A, regulated, and B, has to have some work on the pathways into it, and then obviously into the professional application of it.
I might even ask if one of the professional arborists in the room would like to comment about that. That'd be good. Could we just let one of the arborists respond? Marcus, do you want to, or Ben?
There's no regulation of arborists nationally. There's a few organisations like Arboriculture Australia and the Institute of Australian Consulting Arborists that have qualified members lists, and that's probably the easiest and best way to try and find someone. Unfortunately, because both of those organisations are based on the Eastern Seaboard, they're not very well, they're not very attractive to local arborists, let's put it that way. So there's not as many of us in there as probably there should be.
And in response to people who aren't able to do Slido, we've got a ream of questions coming in, but what we will try and do is leave some time towards the end to answer some that haven't been covered already. I think you may well find that some of the questions coming up will get covered. Okay.
I'll take them on notice too. If there are unanswered questions at the end of the night, you can always email me at the office and I'll attempt to get an answer back to Craig.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, can you commit to any specific regulatory changes as recommended by Uni Adelaide or CCSA?
Well, I'm not going to preempt reviews. So we've got the expert panel. We've got the 30-year, we've got the plan for Greater Adelaide, 30-year plan. So I won't be preempting those, and most importantly, I won't be preempting community consultation. So it's not just people in this room, it's people outside of it. Obviously, there's a range of people who will be interested in it, and they need to be able to provide their feedback.
Excuse me, could I respectfully ask you to speak up?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Does that help?
I have great difficulty hearing what you're saying. Okay.
And bear in mind, many of us have been in rooms like this over the years. And so we're all passionate tonight about seeing change and not to be in another meeting in a couple of years down the track with the same feeling. Is the social licence for tree protection really that difficult to push when the climate crisis is at the forefront of so many voters' minds?
Look, never take the social licence for granted is the answer, because I was in the National Parliament in 2007. We were elected on a climate consensus, and within 3 years that had completely disappeared. And I was on the front line of that, if you like, running for election in both 2010 and 2013. And let me tell you, when that social licence broke down, it became almost impossible to get progress. So I was really, I wouldn't take it for granted. You actually do have to turn up to constant meetings. You do have to fight for these things. Absolutely.
We're the ones fighting for it. You're not. You're not taking it forward. Why are you here?
Well, I don't know if that's true. I've come here tonight at your invitation. I've listened to you. I'm endeavouring not to preempt the review, and this is the sort of the process by which you provide feedback.
Thank you, Sophie. Tom here has dobbed me in to say a few words about social licence, because it's really one of the vital roles for Green Adelaide, which means working with you around what does green space actually mean. And for us in Adelaide, one of the real problems that we face is that green means different things for different people, and we have done so many different things across the city that it's not a homogeneous structure. So you can think about Uncle Tamaroo and what he was saying about the landscape in 1836 was quite vastly different to what it looks like now, and was different in different regions. So the north, your old stomping ground was mallee-box and grasslands. You move through the reed beds of the south, the open woodlands around the Hills Face zone, grasslands, all these different sorts of environments. And they were largely completely cleared. So we actually had basically a completely destroyed landscape. There's only about 3% remnant vegetation left in Adelaide. And as Tom and Stefan have shown, this is vastly different to the cities elsewhere. Not the least also because we are a Mediterranean or a type of Mediterranean climate, whereas most of the other major cities are also either cold, temperate, high rainfall areas or subtropical or tropical cities like Brisbane and Sydney. So they had many more trees and people recognised them and kept them, and they survived much of colonisation they didn't hear. So what we wind up then with is a whole mass of different types of green that are loved by different types of the community. And we don't really understand our green, so we don't really know what we should be doing. And this is probably the first big challenge. So the social licence for some communities, the eastern suburbs, for example, is very much around well-established big trees, but often, not particularly, but quite often they're introduced trees like oak and ash and elm, and we can wind up with a lot of those big ones, which can cause a number of other problems for the natives. Many of our actual trees, our original trees, are on the border of going extinct, as many of you know. So there is also that challenge about how we retain remnant vegetation. So the social licence varies a lot depending on where people are and what it particularly means. We've then got challenges around things like improving the canopy by 20%, and that was in the 30-year plan, as you well know. Well, what does that actually mean? I mean, you can improve by 20% really easily by increasing tree canopy at Port Adelaide or in the north, where in fact there's less than 10% tree canopy there, whilst at the same time chopping down the big old trees in the eastern suburbs or in some of those, the remnant suburbs. So we need to be very careful about what we mean on a different regional space and what do different communities want. And often it's a cultural thing. So some of you will have palm trees. I mean, I'm personally not a big fan of palm trees because they don't really do much environmentally, but they're incredibly important culturally, and they were brought out as ornamentals in the 19th and early 20th century. So we've got cultural trees, and in fact, oak, ash, elm, Moreton Bay figs are actually cultural trees. Well, don't get me started on olives. I mean, and olives are really odd because they were actually introduced and planted here to provide light oils, not as a food. They only became a food item really after the migrations after the Second World War. So they had a really interesting specific purpose, and we have a number of really historic olive groves scattered around the place, but they have created a significant problem as well. So managing that. So what we don't have is a really good understanding about what green means. And so much of the work now is firstly understanding the legal aspects, the social requirements, and then the biology and the ecology of the plants and the ecosystems that we have here, which is why Stefan's work, Tom's, and actually quite a number here, Bob Hill, I don't know if he's here, there's quite a number of people working in this space to really come to grips with, well, firstly, what have we got? Secondly, why do we have it? Thirdly, what does it mean for the various animals that come to share the space? Because again, we get perverse outcomes with animals too. We've tended to retain some great big beautiful eucalypts in some spots around ovals. Well, the bird that loves that is the corella. And so we wind up with 20 to 50,000 corellas moving in. We're not chopping the trees down because the corellas are buggers under no circumstance. But we have another significant management problem there as well. So it's about sorting all this through and deciding, okay, how do we improve the quality of the green space? How do we identify the significantly endangered species that are actually belong on the Adelaide Plains and in the Mount Lofties? And then how do we make the best out of improving the situation? And that's really what Green Adelaide's all about. So we currently invest $1 million a year through grassroots grants, and many of you have got those for around those plantings. We're working with local government to also understand what they want. Often the really important parts of government here are the local government because they know their own community. And they're the ones that often bear the brunt of the significant tree loss. So there are just a few kind of random thoughts about the challenges that we face. It's really difficult. And Green Adelaide is in the process of developing an urban greening strategy, about 2/3 the way through it, and it'll come to you for comment. That we will be putting into or pushing to put into both the review of the planning code and also the 30-year plan. So all of you will get a chance to really comment and drive that as as hard as we possibly can. So there's a lot of opportunity here now to actually develop our understanding and make a real difference. Tom, do you want to? No, Tom doesn't.
Thank you, Chris. Now we'll touch on this one. Will the Native Vegetation Act and regulations be reviewed as many trees and native vegetation are being approved for removal under this Act?
Well, that act's under the Deputy Premier and the Minister for Environment. I don't believe it's going to be reviewed, but I might take that on notice and get back to that.
Yeah.
As part of the planning review, which is on at the moment, the discussion paper, which Stefan mentioned before, has touched a little bit in that area, but it's yet to be seen sort of as to how those recommendations will end up sort of interacting with this whole area. And certainly the reports which we've done from the Conservation Council perspective have touched on those, because a lot of metropolitan Adelaide overlaps with the native vegetation protections. So even parts, for example, of Wattle Park have the native vegetation protection. Yeah, there, perfect. So yeah, just quickly, the discussion paper has had a little bit of look at the native veg review, but as to how much that gets carried over into the recommendations is yet to be seen. Personally, I think that they will need to be looked at in conjunction, because, as was highlighted before, there are so many different acts and so many different areas which touch on trees, and if you start touching one, you've got to have a holistic approach to actually get better outcomes that work for everybody.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, which of the 10 tree protection recommendations for SA law reform do you as the Minister support?
Well, this is a period of community consultation. It's a period of review. You're all providing your feedback. Now, in other areas where we've got reviews, I've said, like the 30-year plan and a range of other things, I've said, well, I'm not going to comment preempting the review before it's all done and dusted. So at an appropriate time, the government will respond, and you'll be able to see that in time and react to it in time. And obviously, we've given an election commitment, and we intend to complete that election commitment, to meet it. And then, obviously, as part of that, we'll be making decisions over the next 4 years.
Like, quite frankly, that's a cop-out. That was my question, and you must be able to say something rather than say nothing. It is not preempting to say which ones you support or which ones appear sensible or which ones have merit. So if you need to take 5 minutes, we will wait.
Look, I don't mind you giving me, your feedback, but you've got to understand that there's a process of government. I know that's not very, it's not what you want to hear, I get that, but there is a process of government. And the process is, we do a review, and then there's a period of internal deliberation, because that's what happens with cabinets, that's what happens with cabinet governments. Ministers just don't get up and say things willy-nilly. We do things in a considered fashion, because that leads to better outcomes. Frankly, it's not a perfect process, but it's a better process than people making things up on the run. And I'm not going to make things up on a run. So if you don't like it, that's fine, and I've heard your feedback, but I'm going to keep to what is a coherent way of making public policy, which is to have a review, to have an election commitment, which you all know, to have a review, which I shouldn't preempt and won't preempt, to get all of your feedback, because there's plenty of people who are not in this room who also deserve their right to have feedback, and then to make public policy in a proper way, which in a considered way, which is by taking it to Cabinet and for other ministers to have their say, and for us to then take it to the Parliament, if that's appropriate, or to regulate, if that's appropriate.
We all want to make sure you stick with your commitments.
I'm sure.
Why can't councils reward residents who retain trees? I should also say, it hasn't come up, but, properties with trees are worth more, right? There's all sorts of... Okay, do you want to respond to that?
So
Kinda, sorta. You know, a property with a house with trees on it has a high amenity value, and it is definitely going to attract a higher price as a result. However, you can probably get more money by bulldozing everything, subdividing that nice garden into 2 or 3 lots, and building some smaller houses, lower building standards, no trees. You will make more money 9 times out of 10 doing that, if the block is big enough to subdivide.
There are also some councils who are trialling a whole lot of kind of innovative thinking around this space. So there's some who want to actually have reduced rates if you have more than 15% cover. I know there's a couple kicking around about the idea of having developers put money into a fund. So if you have a street where there's a lot of division and you're getting one house turned into 4, well, there should be money to buy up properties that could be turned into the pocket parks for kids, or for having some green open space, because you're going to be losing those. We also need to be putting a lot of pressure on commercial and industrial developments. You know, there's a lot of big car parks out there that don't have trees in them, and that's just crazy. We are not. We tend to let a lot of commercial off the hook by not having green walls, green roofs, water-sensitive urban design. There's a lot of opportunities there. You look at the roofs in the city, there's very few green ones. So I think we also need to be value adding. Yes, it is about protecting really important trees and environments, and also doing many of these other kind of innovative things.
Stefan, do you want to add to that, or no? Tom? No? Okay. Now, I guess this is what we're all here because we're passionate about this. When can we expect an outcome from this process?
Well, the expert panel reports next year, early next year, and then the 30-year plan, the regional plans are on at the moment, and then the Adelaide plan will begin and finish the year after. So in that period, obviously, we'll be getting some advice back, advice on these reports and other things, and then we'll be responding over that period.
How about all the improvements and facilities in there?
What year was that?
Well, there's the expert panel reports early next year, so that'll be the first period. The State Planning Commission's already doing.
What do we do now?
Too slow now.
We're going to give it a couple of years. What do you start tomorrow?
Well, do you want me to answer, or do you want to just? I'm happy to get your feedback. If people want to come here and.
I'm just not sure what you want from me here.
They've got a system. You can provide your feedback. I'm happy to hear your feedback. I came here because I wanted to have the interaction, but I get people are frustrated, and you know, I understand the passion. I understand the emotion, but we've got an election commitment. We're committed to fulfilling all of our election commitments. We're going through a process on the best way to do that. That's the best way you get good public policy, to actually listen to people, have long periods of examination of these things so you can get the right outcome. Because you're all telling me that the current outcome, the status quo, isn't good enough. So you only get one shot at reform. So you either do it in a coherent fashion, you build support, you build sort of social licence, you bring the community along with you, because I know everybody in this room is really passionate, but there's a world of people out there as well, and you have to bring them along with you.
Okay. So this one, why have other states been able to do it, but we lag behind again?
Well, I think other states obviously didn't have the changes that were done in 2011, and they've got a range of different responses. One of the reasons when we came to government in opposition, the now Deputy Premier made a commitment to examine our laws against all the other states, to benchmark them, and then to make some policy responses to bring them up to grade. So that's the process we're going through at the moment.
might just add a little bit into that. I think it's really key to come back to, once again, the fact that South Australia here, the tree laws are set by the state government. And I think the Minister here tonight has sort of run people through the process in terms of getting change, whether we like it or not. It does a bit irrelevant. That's sort of how things work. When the protections of vegetation and trees interstate are set by councils, those protections are set to meet the expectations of local communities. And from a local government level, they can move a lot quicker than what state governments can do and have to bring the whole state on board with them to try and get changes in that area. And I think that's one of the really key differences here in terms of if you've got to bring everybody together with you, it is a much more slower process rather than councils who can consult with their own little communities, have much varying different community expectations between, for example, what Mitcham and other areas have. And I think that's why there are some quicker outcomes interstate than what we've had here. And even since, for example, the comparison report's been done by the Conservation Council or the University of Adelaide, a lot of those councils have already changed the laws that they have in regards to trees already. So that there is a tremendous amount of catch-up in this space.
Okay. Will you halt tree clearance while the reviews are being developed? In previous states, clearing accelerated during review periods in anticipation of law change.
Well, I don't know if I have the legal capacity to do that. I'd have to... Well, but ministers aren't invested... it's a legislation that governs these things and the code that governs these things. So I don't... I guess the answer to that is no. I don't want to mislead you, but to be honest, that's not something that's been put to me before tonight.
Sorry, my organisation, Self-Children's Wales Action, has written to you 3 times asking you to pause developments while this review is underway. To say that you haven't been asked is just not simply true, mate. I'm sorry.
Yes. A quick one? Yeah.
This is not about passion. This is about science.
I think you can hear me. This is not about passion, it's about science. There's passion on both sides because there are developers or anyone else you like who can say, no, we want to moderate things and we don't want to have any desperate measures. However, the planet needs desperate measures and we are in a climate crisis. And that's what it's about. It's about the science. Lots of the information that was presented at the beginning of this talk was in a very scientific form. And it is science that we should be listening to and taking note of, because that is what is going to protect us from the carbon crisis. And a tree is a tree and a magnificent sequester of carbon.
Well said. Will you as the Minister support changing the 3-metre circumference to 1.5 to be consistent with other states and effectively prevent clear felling infill development sites?
Well, I might take Sandy's question as a recommendation, perhaps. Look, I don't want to... It's a bit of a difficult position for me because I genuinely don't want to preempt the review and I don't want to preempt community consultation. These reports have been put out there in the public domain by me, so all of you can comment on them, and so all of you can make recommendations to the review, and so that people can, have their say. So I don't want to be preempting it by me standing up here and making a whole lot of universal declarations just to get applause, right? I appreciate that might be more pleasant for all of us than me saying to you, well, I'm listening to you, but I'm not going to give you a running commentary on what I'm going to sign up to or what I'm not, because that's not the role of a minister in a cabinet government. Basically, we have the review, it then gets taken to cabinet, we then announce the decisions.
Okay, now we'll put this one in and maybe we'll even get Chris to chip in on this one. How do we balance more compact infill development with more trees and green space with urban sprawl?
Oh, you give me the really easy questions then. Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Look, yeah, I mean, that's the great conundrum. We know things are developing at pace here, and we have housing crises and all these various things that you know as well as I. So we have to think of a range of solutions. It isn't one size fits all. So on the first stage, yes, we need to identify those trees that are incredibly important. I noticed, Uncle Tamaroo, someone had a question up about how we bring back the red-tailed black cockatoo or the glossy blacks. And they feed on drooping she oak. They've been planting them. They take 30 years to grow, but they have now been planted at Fishery Beach, and those cockatoos are back for the first time in almost 100 years. So you can do it. You can do it by firstly knowing the really good science. They were drooping she oak, so they feed only on those. They flew across from Kangaroo Island. My point about those is that we need a variety of different plants to support a variety of different animals, and we need to do a variety of different things. So much of our future is going to be around relating biodiversity-sensitive urban design and water-sensitive urban design. So planting green walls, green roofs, cycling the water that we have through, using Indigenous plants, using the right plants in the right place, and using the space that we do have. We struggle for space because of the strange way that Adelaide has developed really since 1836. And we have been different to the other cities. One, because all the other ones, with the exception of Melbourne really, had ravines and gorges and hills that acted as refuges for a lot of remnant vegetation. Well, we sort of hit the Adelaide Plains like a plague of locusts and cleared it all away for farms and become really productive. So we didn't leave very much. And then, as we've heard, as Stefan was saying, we developed across the farms, and it went from nothing then to suburbs, and some of those were gradually planted up by people like August Peltzer after, Sophie has just won the Peltzer Prize for greening up the city because of his extraordinary work. So we need to do lots of these different things. We need to be using the little bits of space that we do have. Median strips are incredibly important. The bits outside of the front can all be developed. And they don't actually develop with planting up, both for green aspects, but also there are those who use them for putting in fruit trees and a range of community gardens. Look, if you're walking home, walk past North Street. There's a beautiful little community garden on one housing block tucked away on North Street, right in the middle of the city. We could have one or two of those on every street. Then you start making a huge difference. So it's about using those vacant blocks, those spaces, those pocket parks, and they can be incredibly valuable. We should have a target across the city, a minimum of 30% in my view. That's my personal bias. But then obviously there are places like Mitcham that need to have a lot more than that. Dr. Holmes-Ross has nodded in furious agreement here. And that we also then can get away from the social inequities we have with having some areas with less than 10% and others with upwards of 50%. So yeah, lots of things to do and lots of things that can be done by individuals, by small groups, by streets, by community members, as well as by local government and state government. So it's actually about partnerships. And one of the things Green Adelaide, through the National Park City Initiative, is really promoting partnerships, because that's the only way we're going to get sufficient investment and sufficient buy-in. And those partnerships are also really important for education. You know, we have all sorts of people arriving in Adelaide from all sorts of places, many of which do not have trees. I mean, they come from cities and communities all around the world that have been devoid of trees for generations. So their baseline is much, much lower than ours. So we have to also make sure that everybody in the community realises how important green space is. And that was alluded to by Minister Chapman a moment ago, is that we have this major group in our community who are not you, who are not me, and who don't get it, that trees are important. There are some local government areas where there are thousands of requests a month to chop down trees because they're dropping leaves and they're too much work to clean up. And then there are other nearby local governments where people chain themselves to the trees if you even look at them sideways. So how can we have this variation in one city in the way people view and appreciate our trees? So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of the education of our community, of the the new and newer South Australians and those in different regions where there isn't an equal appreciation of trees. But a lot of work, and it's going to take quite a while. But as someone once said, we should have started yesterday. We should have started the day before yesterday, but we can always start now.
Okay, we're going to take 3 more questions. Do you agree that all new developments should be designed around existing trees?
Well, let's see what the review says. Let's see what the reports say. I know, well, but like, you got to understand, right? I can't preempt reviews. I can take your feedback, and from the tenor of your questions, I understand your passion. Very useful. All the questions can come to my office, and I'll refer them on to the expert committee. Happy to do that, and happy to come back here once it's all concluded, and we can have another conversation.
So there are going to be reams of questions we don't even get to. So we're going to make sure that they get passed on to Craig and Joanna, and they will get sent through to the Minister. And conservation, so you will be kept in the loop after this. Will the Open Space Fund be reimbursed after it was plundered to pay for the code?
Now, I think this is referring to the actions of the previous government, because the code was put in by the previous government. So what happens is the fund gets replenished every year. I mean, I guess I can't, it will be replenished, but as to, I can't sort of make amends for the actions of a previous government.
Last question that someone else might be able to answer. Someone referred to the Resilient South planning. Are trees currently being economically included as assets in our forward planning under the resilient regional programs?
Okay. Are trees being included? Thank you, Stefan.
I don't think this is really connected to the resilient regions, but trees on public land are not viewed as assets. They're not viewed in asset management frameworks, but there is interest in doing so. So there are various methodologies for valuing trees. You can go out and you can fill in a process that pumps out a dollar value, and certainly a lot of councils are looking at that for valuing their urban forests. There's also, that process can be used to value trees on private land, which might be used to identify what kind of offset might be payable in some circumstances. So it's definitely something that both public and private organisations are looking at, but it's not part of the framework at the moment.
Okay. Thank you, Stefan. And the last one we're going to do, can the Minister consider any minor interim actions ahead of a formal reform? Communicating with councils via email with recommendations could be a good start.
Well, of course, I might consider things in advance, and I might make recommendations, just as we did with the grey box trees down in Jane's electorate. So we are doing things. I don't want people to think that we don't take action where we see opportunities. Of course we do. But it's just, and I understand the mood of the room is for immediate action and that you're frustrated at what's been going on for the better part of a decade. But you do have to, I suppose, acknowledge that I can't click my fingers and create legislative or regulatory reform overnight. Okay.
Now, we have a special gift for you. It's not the bottle of red you were looking forward to.
No, I think some people are probably going to give me a piece of their mind after the meeting, I see.
Okay, so are you going to click the slide? There we are. Okay, so you might have noticed that the guys ushering you in this morning, this evening, have got a T-shirt which says, "I'm a tree champion." You can order those T-shirts. There is an order form, old school, out in the foyer, and you can pay for it. Now, we will just point out that the Minister gets his own, So it says you're the tree champion.
Good.
So, okay.
All right, good. I like it.
Thank you, Minister.
Thanks.
Okay.
I live in the western suburbs, and I'm very close to where the Crows want to actually take over what they call the 70 Oval precinct. That's the Oval, just the Oval, but they want to take over the King's Reserve. We've estimated that over 150 trees will have to be removed to cater to an MCG size oval and an Adelaide oval development. We lose access to the only piece of green space that we have locally to our community. And we have been kept in the dark for the last 2 years. And this is going to happen and keep on happening while they move their reform process. This is the here and now. And we're very, very concerned locally about what's happening to us as you've experienced and witnessed as everybody is. And I think everybody needs to be aware of that. I mean, everybody is aware of that. That's why they're here. But I'm very, very distressed. And to be put off on these and not be able to recognise what we're all clamouring for is really, really disheartening for a Labor government that all of us voted for, most people did, because they were listening to the community. Listen now.
We all go away from here wanting change, and we need to stay connected, and we need to keep fighting for it and make sure that change comes as a result of this. We need to thank all the speakers. We need to thank the organising groups, Conservation Council of South Australia, National Trust, Trees for Life, Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, TreeNet, the Nature Conservation Society of South Australia, and the many other wonderful volunteer and community campaigners and advocates. Please make sure that you jump on the screen above, write down the details there, and contact your elected members and other decision makers to let them know how much you love trees and want them protected. So if we keep causing trouble, sorry? And vote in local elections, absolutely. Yeah. So we're in this amazing age of communication, right? And messages get out there very quickly now. So make sure that you stay connected and support organisations like the organisations that are put tonight on, and they will keep you updated. And then if we all individually put pressure on people, we can make a change. Thank you.
And please thank the wonderful Sophie. Good night.